Good evening, everybody. This is Rinpoche getting ready to read another passage from Siddhartha. Just to let you know, this is episode number 7, and we are not even 2/3 through the book. So we're going to be here for a while. And I do want to remind you that you don't need to sit and look at me reading. If you want to, I'm happy to have you do that. But if you want to lie down and just listen, that's fine with me. In fact, I won't even know, will I? Anyway, Siddhartha, in our last segment, really took a turn for the worse. He became extremely worldly. He got rich, crabby. He drinks a lot, and he's a gambler. All these things are very shocking to us because in Buddhism, of course, we have a very different story about Siddhartha. But I'm enjoying this, and I've noticed, I don't think I've mentioned it here, I've noticed that the format that Herman Hesse is using here certainly sounds a lot like sutra. And so I see a lot of elements, because I know sutras, I see a lot of elements here from classic Buddhism. And of course, there's a great deal of Dharma advice and examples here. But I didn't want Siddhartha to be an example. And so at the end of our last session, Siddhartha had hit bottom. I hope he hit bottom. I don't know what's coming next. I just read the next sentence, and now I begin. But let me actually go back. Let me go back here a couple of sentences. He who staked 10,000 on the throw of the dice and laughed became more hard and mean in business, and sometimes dreamt of money at night. And whenever he awakened from this hateful spell, when he saw his face reflected in the mirror on the wall of his bedroom, grown older and uglier, whenever shame and nausea overtook him, he fled again, fled to a new game of chance, fled in confusion to passion, to wine, and from there back again to the urge for acquiring and hoarding wealth. He wore himself out in this senseless cycle, became old and sick. Now we go on. Then a dream once reminded him. He had been with Kamala in the evening in her lovely pleasure garden. They sat under a tree talking. Kamala was speaking seriously, and grief and weariness were concealed behind her words. She asked him to tell her about Gautama, and could not hear enough about him. How clear his eyes were, how peaceful and beautiful his mouth, how gracious his smile, how peaceful his entire manner. For a long time, he had to talk to her about the illustrious Buddha. And Kamala had sighed and said, "One day, perhaps soon, I will also become a follower of the Buddha. I will give him my pleasure garden and take refuge in his teachings." But then she enticed him, and in love play she clasped him to her with extreme fervor, fiercely and tearfully, as if she wanted once more to extract the last sweet drop from this fleeting pleasure. Never had it been so strangely clear to Siddhartha how closely related passion was to death. Then he lay beside her, and Kamala's face was near to his, and under her eyes and near the corners of her mouth, he read clearly for the first time a sad sign, fine lines and wrinkles, a sign which gave a reminder of autumn and old age. Siddhartha himself, who was only in his 40s, had noticed gray hairs here and there in his black hair. Weariness was written on Kamala's beautiful face, weariness from continuing along a long path which had no joyous goal. Weariness and incipient old age, and concealed and not yet mentioned, perhaps a not yet conscious fear. Fear of the autumn of life, fear of old age, fear of death. Sighing, he took leave of her, his heart full of misery and secret fear. Then Siddhartha had spent the night at his house with dancers and wine, had pretended to be superior to his companions, which he no longer was. He had drunk much wine, and late after midnight he went to bed, tired and yet agitated, nearly in tears and in despair. In vain did he try to sleep. His heart was so full of misery. He felt he could no longer endure it. He was full of a nausea which overpowered him, like a distasteful wine, or music that was too sweet and superficial, or like the too sweet smile of the dancers, or the too sweet perfume of their hair and breasts. But above all, he was nauseated with himself, with his perfumed hair, with the smell of wine from his mouth, with the soft, flabby appearance of his skin. Like one who has eaten and drunk too much and vomits painfully and then feels better, so did the restless man wish he could rid himself with one terrific heave of these pleasures, of these habits, of this entirely senseless life. Only at daybreak and at the first signs of activity outside his townhouse did he doze off and had a few moments of semi-oblivion, a possibility of sleep. During that time, he had a dream. Kamala kept a small, rare songbird in a small golden cage. It was about this bird that he dreamt. This bird, which usually sang in the morning, became mute, and as this surprised him, he went up to the cage and looked inside. The little bird was dead and lay stiff on the floor. He took it out, held it a moment in his hand, and then threw it away on the road. And at the same moment he was horrified, and his heart ached as if he had thrown away, with this dead bird, all that was good and of value in himself. Awakening from this dream, he was overwhelmed by a feeling of great sadness. It seemed to him that he had spent his life in a worthless and senseless manner. He retained nothing vital, nothing in any way precious or worthwhile. He stood alone, like a shipwrecked man on shore. Sadly, Siddhartha went to a pleasure garden that belonged to him, closed the gates, and sat under a mango tree, and felt horror and death in his heart. He sat and felt himself dying, withering, finishing. Gradually, he collected his thoughts and mentally went through the whole of his life, from the earliest days which he could remember. When had he really been happy? When had he really experienced joy? Well, he had experienced this several times. He had tasted it in the days of his boyhood, when he had won praise from the Brahmins, when he far outstripped his contemporaries, when he excelled himself at the recitation of the holy verses, in argument with the learned men, when assisting at the sacrifices. Then he had felt in his heart, a path lies before you, which you are called to follow. The gods await you. And again, as a youth, when his continually soaring goal had propelled him in and out of the crowd of similar seekers, when he had striven hard to understand the Brahman's teachings, and when every freshly acquired knowledge only engendered a new thirst, then again, in the midst of his thirst, in the midst of his efforts, he had thought, onwards, onwards, this is your path. He had heard this voice when he had left his home and chosen the life of the samanas. And again, when he left the samanas and gone to the perfect one. And also when he had left him for the unknown. How long was it now since he had heard this voice, since he had soared to any heights? How flat and desolate his path had been. How many long years he had spent without any lofty goal, without any thirst, without any exaltation, content with small pleasures, and yet never really satisfied. Without knowing it, he had endeavored and longed for all these years to be like all these other people, like these children, and yet his life had been much more wretched and poorer than theirs, for their aims were not his, nor their sorrows his. This whole world of the Kamashwami people had only been a game to him, a dance, a comedy which one watches. Only Kamala was dear to him. Had he been of value to him? But was she still? Did he still need her? And did she still need him? Were they not playing a game without an end? Was it necessary to live for? No. This game was called samsara, a game for children, a game which was perhaps enjoyably played once, twice, 10 times, but was it worth playing continually? Then Siddhartha knew that the game was finished, that he could play it no longer. A shudder passed through his body. He felt as if something had died. He sat all that day under the mango tree, thinking of his father, thinking of Govinda, thinking of Gautama. Had he left all these in order to become a Kamashwami? He sat there till night fell. When he looked up and saw the stars, he thought, I am sitting here under my mango tree in my pleasure garden. He smiled a little. Was it necessary? Was it right? Was it not a foolish thing that he should possess a mango tree and a garden? He had finished with that. That also died in him. He rose, said farewell to the mango tree and the pleasure garden. As he had not had any food that day, he felt extremely hungry and thought of his house in the town, of his room and bed, of the table with food. He smiled wearily, shook his head, and said goodbye to these things. The same night, Siddhartha left his garden and the town and never returned. For a long time, Kamashwami tried to find him, believing he had fallen into the hands of bandits. Kamala did not try to find him. She was not surprised when she learned that Siddhartha had disappeared. Had she not always expected it? Was he not a samana, without a home, a pilgrim? She had felt it more than ever at their last meeting. And in the midst of her pain at her loss, she rejoiced that she had pressed him so close to her heart on that last occasion, had felt so completely possessed and mastered by him. When she heard the first news of Siddhartha's disappearance, she went to the window where she kept a rare songbird in a golden cage. She opened the door of the cage, took the bird out, and let it fly away. For a long time, she looked after the disappearing bird. From that day, she received no more visitors and kept her house closed. After a time, she found that she was with child as a result of her last meeting with Siddhartha. The next chapter, By the River. Siddhartha wandered into the forest, already far from the town, and knew only one thing, that he could never go back, that the life he had lived for many years was past, tasted and drained to a degree of nausea. The songbird was dead. Its death, which he had dreamt about, was the bird in his own heart. He was deeply entangled in samsara. He had drawn nausea and death to him from all sides, like a sponge that absorbs water until it's full. He was full of ennui, full of misery, full of death. There was nothing left in the world that could attract him, that could give him pleasure and solace. He wished passionately for oblivion, to be at rest, to be dead. If only a flash of lightning would strike him, if only a tiger would come and eat him, if there were only some wine, some poison that would give him oblivion, that would make him forget, that would make him sleep and never awaken. Was there any kind of filth which he had not besmirched himself, any sin and folly which he had not committed, any stain upon his soul for which he alone had not been responsible? Was it then still possible to live? Was it possible to take in breath again and again, to breathe out, to feel hunger, to eat again, to sleep again, to lie with women again? Was this cycle not exhausted and finished for him? Siddhartha reached the long river in the wood, the same river across which a ferryman had once taken him when he was still a young man and had come from Gautama's town. He stopped at this river and stood hesitatingly on the bank. Fatigue and hunger had weakened him. Why should he go any further? Where and for what purpose? There was no more purpose. There was nothing more than a deep, painful longing to shake off this whole confused dream, to spit out this stale wine, to make an end of this bitter, painful life. There was a tree on the riverbank, a coconut tree. Siddhartha leaned against it, placed his arm around the trunk, and looked down into the green water which flowed beneath him. He looked down and was completely filled with a desire to let himself go and be submerged in the water. A chilly emptiness in the water reflected the terrible emptiness in his soul. Yes, he was at the end. There was nothing more for him but to efface himself, to destroy the unsuccessful structure of his life, to throw it away, mocked at by the gods. That was the deed which he longed to commit, to destroy the form which he hated. Might the fishes devour him, this dog of a Siddhartha, this madman, this corrupted and rotting body, this sluggish and misused soul? Might the fishes and crocodiles devour him? Might the demons tear him to little pieces? With a distorted countenance, he stared into the water. He saw his face reflected and spat at it. He took his arm away from the tree trunk and turned a little so that he could fall headlong and finally go under. He bent with closed eyes toward death. Then, from a remote part of his soul, from the past of his tired life, he heard a sound. It was one word, one syllable, which, without thinking, he spoke indistinctly. The ancient beginning and ending of all Brahmin prayers. The holy Om, which had the meanings of the perfect one or perfection. At that moment when the sound of Om reached Siddhartha's ears, his slumbering soul suddenly awakened and he recognized the folly of his action. Siddhartha was deeply horrified. So that was what he had come to. He was so lost, confused, so devoid of all reason that he sought death. This wish, this childish wish, had grown so strong within him to find peace by destroying his body. All the torment of these recent times, all the disillusionment, all the despair had not affected him so much as it did the moment the Om reached his consciousness and he recognized his wretchedness and his crime. Om, he pronounced inwardly, and he was conscious of Brahman, of the indestructibleness of life. He remembered all that he had forgotten, all that was divine. But it was only for a moment, a flash. Siddhartha sank down at the foot of the coconut tree, overcome by fatigue. Murmuring, "Oh," he laid his head on the tree roots and sank into a deep sleep. His sleep was deep and dreamless. He had not slept like that for a long time. When he awakened after many hours, it seemed to him as if 10 years had passed. He heard the soft rippling of the water. He did not know where he was, nor what had brought him there. He looked up and was surprised to see the trees and the sky above him. He remembered where he was and how he came to be there. He felt a desire to remain there for a long time. The past now seemed to him to be covered by a veil, extremely remote, very unimportant. He only knew that his previous life At the first moment of his return to consciousness, his previous life seemed to him like a remote incarnation, like an earlier birth of his present self. Was finished, that it was so full of nausea and wretchedness that he had wanted to destroy it, but that he had come to himself by a river, under a coconut tree, with the holy word, Om, on his lips. Then he had fallen asleep, and on awakening, he looked at the world like a new man. Softly he said the word, Om, to himself, over which he had fallen asleep. And it seemed to him as if his whole sleep had been a long, deep pronouncing of Om, thinking of Om, an immersion and penetration into Om, into the nameless, into the divine. What a wonderful sleep it had been. Never had a sleep so refreshed him, so renewed him, so rejuvenated him. Perhaps he had really died. Perhaps he had been drowned and was reborn in another form. No, he recognized himself. He recognized his hands and feet, the place where he lay, and the self in his breast. Siddhartha, self-willed, individualistic. But this Siddhartha was somehow changed, renewed. He had slept wonderfully. He was remarkably awake, happy, and curious. Siddhartha raised himself and saw a monk in a young gown with shaved head, sitting opposite him in the attitude of a thinker. He looked at the man, who had neither hair on his head nor a beard, and he did not look at him long enough when he recognized in this monk Govinda, the friend of his youth, Govinda, who had taken refuge in the illustrious Buddha. Govinda had also aged, but he still showed the old characteristics in his face: eagerness, loyalty, curiosity, anxiety. But when Govinda, feeling his glance, raised his eyes and looked at him, Siddhartha saw that Govinda did not recognize him. Govinda was pleased to find him awake. Apparently, he had sat there for a long time waiting for him to awaken, although he did not know him. "I was sleeping," said Siddhartha. "How did you come here?" "You were sleeping," answered Govinda, "and it is not good to sleep in such places where there are often snakes and animals from the forest prowling about. I am one of the followers of the illustrious Gautama, the Buddha of Shakyamuni, and I am on a pilgrimage with a number of our order. I saw you lying asleep in a dangerous place, so I tried to awaken you. And then, as I saw you were sleeping very deeply, I remained behind my brothers and sat by you. Then it seemed that I, who wanted to watch over you, fell asleep myself. Weariness overcame me, and I kept my watch badly. But now you are awake, so I must go and overtake my brothers. I thank you, Samana, for guarding my sleep. The followers of the illustrious one are very kind, but now you may go on your way." "I am going. May you keep well." "I thank you, Samana." Govinda bowed and said, "Goodbye." "Goodbye, Govinda," said Siddhartha. The monk stood still. "Excuse me, sir, how do you know my name?" Thereupon Siddhartha laughed. "I know you, Govinda, from your father's house, and from the Brahmin school, and from the sacrifices, and from our sojourn with the Samanas, and from that hour in the grove of Jetavana when you swore allegiance to the illustrious one." "You are Siddhartha," cried Govinda aloud. "Now I recognize you and do not understand why I did not recognize you immediately." "Greetings, Siddhartha. It gives me great pleasure to see you again." "I am also pleased to see you again. You have watched over me in my sleep. I thank you once again, although I need no guard." "Where are you going, my friend?" And that's where we're going to end. Whew. I feel like we came out of a very dark place. I wasn't going to stop reading until Siddhartha was saved, and it looks interesting. Where will it go from here? We'll see you tomorrow evening. Stay safe and happy. Many blessings. Please meditate as much as possible. And please pray for all sentient beings to be safe and well. Good night. May my capacity for compassion be infinite. I dedicate these efforts to complete and total enlightenment so that I may be of benefit to all sentient beings. May it be so. Good night.